go. All righty. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth telling and myth busting. And on the program, we welcome back our returning champion. She's one of my favorite peoples of all time. She's my heroine, sheroe. We have back on Elle Jones. Elle Jones, who's a poet, social racial justice activist, abolitionist, anti-imperialist, all-round superb Black Canadian leftist, and she's a journalist for The Breach and Halifax Examiner. And if you want a collection of Elle's poetry, get the book Life from the African Resistance. And I've not gotten this book exactly. And I've not gotten this book yet, but do get her latest publication, Abolitionist Intimacies. And Elle was a contributor to Sick of the System, Why the COVID-19 Recovery Must Be Revolutionary, another book I need to urgently get. And she's co-host of Black Power Hour at CKDU 88.1 FM, a community or campus radio station in Halifax. And she's a university professor. She's the assistant professor in the Department of Political and Canadian Studies at Mount Saint Vincent University in Halifax, Nova Scotia. She's my guest for the hour or so. So, Miss Jones, Elle, or Dr. Jones. I think I should be calling you that, actually, for the time I have to speak to you. Welcome back.
Well, thank you for having me back. Sorry about the delay.
Oh, no, all good. It's always an honor to have you back. And and I just have to say this because 1+1, we had our 300th episode not so long ago, and I'm always super excited to talk to you and have you on because I know that you're always going to tear the house down with your truth bombs and your myth busting, and a lot of people I know, they love your passion, they love your humanity and compassion you have for victims of our unjust system and prison advocacy.
I'm leaning over because I'm trying to fix this lighting, but it's not working. So.
Oh,
that's
okay,
better. There you go. Okay.
Perfect.
All right. Sorry. Yeah. Sorry.
Oh, yes. And
trying to be subtle, but I couldn't find the cord.
Actually, just before we start, oh yes, and remember, folks, please share widely 1+1's contents, past and present, and recently upload stuff. It's the only way to help us overcome the far right algorithms and help us get a good, sizable audience. And please, you can donate to 1+1. Please donate generously if you can. We're entirely independent media, so any donations is greatly appreciated. So, Elle, my first question I wanted to ask you is: earlier this year, you had the chance to go to Israel, historic Palestine, and you got the chance to go to what remains of Indigenous Palestine. Can you actually talk about your journey, what you witnessed and experienced, and curious if you got to meet Palestinian voices? And when it comes to that question, what do they think the future entails for them in the wake of the ceasefire and the mother of all genocidal onslaughts Israel inflicted the past several months and roughly 2 years? I'm curious your response to that.
It's a lot of questions. Yeah, so I was in Palestine. I was in the West Bank, so literally Palestine. I was there for about 2 weeks. We went through Jordan, so we flew into Amman, and then we actually stayed in Madaba. Black Iris Hotel, if anybody wants to stay there, great hotel.
Interesting.
And then we went on to Palestine. I'm going to pause in Jordan for a moment because one of the first things, so when I was going, of course, I got invited. So it was a delegation of scholars of conscience. So it was through Sabeel. So Sabeel is known for mostly doing interventions into tours of the so-called Holy Land, although Palestinians would say that all land is holy. So they began about 40 years ago. Because of course, priests, rabbis, religious schools, always come through, like everyone goes through Jerusalem in particular. And so they had sat down with a delegation that included the Anglican Bishop of Ottawa at the time and talked to him about the Palestinian experience. And after that, they said, well, now what are you going to do? And that Christmas, which was like 82 or 83 or something, the bishop preached about, I'm assuming, I don't know what the sermon is. I'm going to assume it had something to do with Christ being born in Bethlehem and Palestine, etc., from the pulpit in Ottawa, and was met by like Zionist backlash to that sermon. So they realized at that point that there would need to be sort of like a stronger organizing. So Friends of Sabeel was formed, which exists in different European countries, in Canada, in the US, and then Sabeel itself, which is in East Jerusalem. So they organize usually a couple of delegations a year, and they've been religious in character usually. So rabbis, religious, like theologians, etc. But after October 7th, they've expanded. They're running many more delegations, and they've included non-religious delegations as well. So our delegation was scholars of conscience from 6 different countries, many Asian countries. So we had South Korea, Japan, Burma, Myanmar.
Interesting.
Scholars of the Rohingya genocide um, were present as well, and then also Ireland, the US, and Canada. So there was a number of different countries, and yeah, so that was actually like one of the non-religious delegations. What else can I say about that? So yeah, so Sabeel organizes everything. So you're just beautifully hosted. The hospitality was unbelievable. Oh, I was going to say that's why I lost my train of thought. Part of the reason why they're bringing in more delegations is also for the economic impact. So of course, Israel is propped up by the US by these billions of dissent that is able to offset the economic damage of the war. But in both, I shouldn't call it the war, the genocide, but of in both Jordan, which is 50% Palestinian, right? So the refugees are 48, 67, like Jordan is 50% Palestinian. And so of course that tourism is really down because people usually come to Jordan and then go to Palestine, like into Jerusalem, into, so the tourism has completely collapsed. And of course, for Palestinians who work in most of the low wage jobs and being blocked from working in Israel and crossing the borders, and of course, many work in the hospitality industry. So people were saying, I used to drive cabs, like 4 groups every day, and I drive 2 a month now. The hotels were empty. Like we stayed in Christmas hotel in Jerusalem, and they had to open for us. There was like nobody else staying. And sorry, not in Jerusalem, in Bethlehem. No, in Jerusalem. Yeah, in Jerusalem, we stayed in the Christmas hotel. During the Christmas season, we went around Epiphany. So like January the 6th, it was still Armenian Christmas on the 13th. So this is high tourist season and the hotels were closed. So one of the things Sabeel does is spend money with Palestinians or like Armenians or people that are, so we had Palestinian tour guides. We were encouraged to like spend our money, so that's part of the point of the delegations too, is to also show it is safe to go into Palestine. You can go to Palestine. You can ethically go to Palestine. And then we also, of course, met with community. We went into community. We met with a number of people. So it was a witnessing delegation. But if you are thinking of going to Palestine, I really encourage you to go. You can go through Jordan. I mean, it's not cheap, as in any sort of like flight isn't cheap, but it's worth going, and I encourage people to go, but stay with Palestinians. Make sure you use Palestinian drivers, Palestinian restaurants. That actually will help people. So that was kind of the purpose, as well as witnessing, was for them to bring in people.
Did you get a chance to go to Israel by any chance, like Tel Aviv?
We didn't go into Tel Aviv. We went to Yafa. So we stayed in the West Bank mostly. So like I said, we came into Jordan. We went through the crossing in King Hussein Bridge, so Allenby crossing, which Israel illegally inserts themselves into. So it's the crossing between Palestine and Jordan, but Israel, of course, inserts themselves into that crossing. They had just started a new visa that you have to get online and apply for, but we were all worried about it, but it was like pretty automatic, but you do have to get like this visa process. And then when you go, that sort of, the first thing you see is that there's a line for Palestinians and then like foreign people. So if you're traveling on the imperial passport, you sort of like walk right through. And if you're Palestinian from Jordan trying to get into Palestine, go home, visit family, there's like a massive crowd. And that line, like not everybody gets through. And, people have to come at sort of 5 a.m. to start lining up. So right away you see that difference, right? And like the difficulty that Palestinians have traveling between. But we went through that crossing, and then we went to Ramallah for the first couple of days. And then we were also we stayed in Jerusalem, in Bethlehem. We went to Aida refugee camp. We went to Bedouin communities. We went to Hebron, South Hebron Hills, in Bedouin communities in the South Hebron Hills. We went to a number of farming communities, Tent of Nations, Wadi Fukin. So sort of every day we were in a different community. So like we'd really like leave the hotel at 8 a.m. and get back at kind of 9 p.m. And all day we were meeting with different delegations, going and witnessing and seeing what was on the ground. our host was actually, our tour guide was, our guide was Larine Abu Aklis, so Shireen Abu Aklis' niece.
Oh,
So
fascinating.
yeah, so, and of course, because of who Shireen was in Palestine, that name opened so many doors. So when we submitted kind of who we wanted to meet with and who we wanted to see, if they were in Palestine, we met with them. Like if they were available, we met with them. We were able to meet with Munta Isaac, who did the sermon Christ Under the Rubble that went viral a couple of Christmas ago. He has a book
Very
coming out.
well, very
Yeah.
well known Palestinian Christian archbishop.
Yeah, so liberation theologist preached that sermon. You don't have to be Christian or religious in any way to watch and appreciate that sermon. So if you look up Christ Under the Rubble, you can find it on YouTube. It's a scathing decolonial liberation sermon. And so we met with him. He has a book coming out. He's probably on tour right now. So he was very, very busy, but took the time to meet with us. We met Mustafa Barghouti. So we spent time with him, and while we were with him, the doctor who had gone missing, his wife was calling from Gaza like repeatedly. So that was taking place as we were meeting with Barghouti. We met with many victims of torture, political prisoners. So we heard those recountings of torture, arrest. Virtually everyone we met with, everyone who was hosting us had been arrested, beaten, tortured, abused. Almost like as an aside, you'd just be talking to someone, they'd be like, oh yeah, like he just got out like 3 months ago and he just relearned to walk, and that would just be something that was being said as we were moving to other things. We met Issa Amro in Hebron, Youth Against Settlement. And also the Women's Collective in that community cooked for us. We met a young man, Mohammed, who had been arrested and beaten multiple times. One of the women who was cooking, her son had just been taken like the night before. We met with the Afro-Palestinian community, which might be of interest to you. I actually had requested that specifically because, as we know, there's quite a bit of Hasbara around Palestinians are racist and anti-Black, right? Actually, right when I was going there, the thing had come out where people were saying online that there's a ghetto in Gaza that's like named for Black people, and then it's like, well, okay, if that does exist, you realize Israel would be bombing them, right? So even if that were true, that would mean a community of Black people were being bombed into oblivion. But one of those kind of targets of Israeli propaganda has been this notion that Palestinians are ragingly anti-Black. And yeah, we were seeing that propaganda. And Israel, of course, also promotes like Ethiopian Jews, like serving in the IDF as this
Yeah.
example of diversity and racial diversity. So I asked to meet with Afro-Palestinians, and we were taken on a tour of East Jerusalem with some of the leaders of the Afro-Palestinian community, including a man named Mahmoud, who had been imprisoned in the War of 67 and had only been let out in like 83 or 85 in a prisoner exchange. And so he took it, so we saw where, like, I mean, there's been Africans in Palestine. Palestine has been multiracial forever. That's the point, right? That the Armenian community has been there like 1600 years, Greeks, like Ethiopians, like everybody has been there. And it's only with, of course, this rise of Jewish supremacy as an ideology that has changed that idea that people always lived, including Jewish people, like everybody lived side by side, So that was really good. We were able to meet those communities, and yeah, and then also go like on the ground into a number of like farming communities and just see what was happening. So is really transformative in terms of even just understanding organizing, what people taught us about organizing, about resilience, and then also to hear and see what was happening firsthand. So yeah.
Actually, very quickly before I get to this question, so were you and I witness to any systemic human rights abuses that we often know that Israel does on a daily basis, not just in Gaza but West Bank and East Jerusalem?
Yeah, so of course, right when we were there, we left like 2 days before the ceasefire, the so-called ceasefire. And of course, that was accompanied by a deliberate, as has been happening for many years, but an escalation in the West Bank. So we were actually there when 3 soldiers had been like ambushed and killed outside of Ramallah. So everything was shut down. We couldn't get into Nablus, like, which is just a very common experience in Palestine, that access is cut off. Omar, who is the director of Sabeel, lives in Ramallah but works in Jerusalem, and he has to leave his house at 4:30 every morning because you don't know if you're going to be held up at the checkpoint for 4 hours, 5 hours, if you'll get through it all. And that's just Palestinian life. So the license plates are different. Israelis have yellow license plates, Palestinians have white license plates. When we were in Bethlehem, you know, if you go from a community right outside of Bethlehem that's a minute away, you have to drive around for like half an hour because you can't go on the road because the road is only for Israelis. So settlers are given, for example, like they'll get very cheap houses. So like it might have been like 25,000 US to get a house to encourage people. They won't pay taxes. Like they don't pay water. This is to encourage settlers to come. Palestinians pay taxes. Israel appropriates their taxes and then uses it to do things like build an overpass that only Israelis can go on. This is normal. Like, you know, Saidiya Hartman in Scenes of Subjection, when she talks about the brutality of slavery and, you know, the sort of extreme brutality that always makes the slave narratives versus like the everyday humiliations that make up the oppression of slavery, like the system of domination. And that's Palestine. So, you know, there's horrors where you would hear from a political prisoner about like, you know, Israel starving them, beating them, peeing on them, raping them, like setting dogs on them, you know, just like every sort of worst human rights violation. But every day is a human rights violation when you live in Palestine. And that is just treated as normal life. Like it's normal that everybody has different license plates. It's normal that you can't go on the road. It's normal, of course, that there's checkpoints everywhere. In Yafa, they built like a train service and it doesn't stop in a single Arab neighborhood and it stops in all the Jewish neighborhoods. So even when there's like 100,000 people living in the Arab neighborhood, the train will not stop there. And that is normal. There's only ever been one Arab member of the Knesset, sorry, like cabinet minister in the Knesset. Like the water board, the education board, these things that control like Arab Palestinian, you know what they call Arab Israeli citizens and brag about like they are equal. They're not. There's like 213 plus laws that privilege Jewish people over Arab people. In the schools, the children learned that the Nakba was Jewish Independence Day, if you're Palestinian. And there's the Palestinian curriculum and the like Hebrew curriculum, and they literally raid the schools to remove books and arrest teachers. Like they'll stop kids on the street and check their backpacks to see if they have like the approved like Hebrew text. And if you're teaching Palestinian history, like the schools are literally raided. Like the teachers are arrested, the children are harassed and arrested. Like this is the kind of everyday thing that you see. But beyond that, in Hebron, so Hebron, which is of course where Baruch Goldstein committed his massacre of, what was it, 29 people praying at in the mosque. And so and as a result,
I believe, right?
yes, like they cleared out Hebron, which was like a very bustling, it's like the has in contest like the oldest city in the world, you know. The whole downtown is a ghost town because they forced like 100,000 Palestinians to evacuate the downtown so that 4,000 armed militias and military can protect the 400 illegal settlers, illegal under international and Israeli law, that are occupying Hebron. So when you go into Hebron, which is where Ben-Gvir is from, like you drive by his house, you go through a checkpoint. We got stopped 8 times in about 800 meters. So we got out of the van, we got stopped by police, they interrogated us, they interrogated Omar. They were asking like, why don't you speak Hebrew? Are you Muslim? You know, like, and then we get interrogated for like 5 minutes. We'd walk literally 10 meters. Another soldier would come over, pretend they hadn't just seen go through the whole thing again, write your name down on a list, send us to the police station, send us to a checkpoint. We'd walk up the road. They said militia pulled up armed, you know, send us back to the checkpoint. And like over and over and over again, like this is just the kind of intimidation. And then when we went up into like the Palestinian neighborhoods in the hills, like they have to be surrounded by sandbags. They've reinforced their windows like 5 times with steel because Ben-Gvir has armed the settlers. So he's like, my neighbor's 17 years old. He has 2 violent convictions. Ben-Gvir has given him an M16 and he takes pot shots at me. And that's how you live. Like we saw settlers with like their baby on their hip and like a M16 slung over their back. That is normal. So, you know, like that kind of like apartheid state that you're experiencing. And while we're getting stopped and sent back and forth, there's busloads of like Americans, like exploring settlement that are watching this happen, like in front of them, while we get taunted and harassed and humiliated and have guns pulled on us. So yeah, that was Hebron. So one of the things that the people in Hebron, that Issa Amro and the people in Hebron said to us is, my existence is resistance. And when people say that in the West, they mean like I took a selfie, but in Palestine, they mean like staying on the land is the highest form of resistance. So everything is there to force you out. People get like 6 hours of water a week, if you're lucky. You'd be told you can't build on the land. Like obviously there's legal like lawfare on people to like strip people of their titles, remove people, evacuate people. They're constantly, of course, they don't give you permits to build. They bulldoze your houses constantly. So just staying on the land in the face of this kind of violence, and everything is done to inconvenience you, because eventually you're like, I have children. My daughter is getting harassed and humiliated every time she goes to school. If I move, I don't have to experience that, right? So this is the idea, to chase people out. Many Palestinians said the young IDF women are often the worst. They love to sexually humiliate like young Palestinian women. That was a common experience.
Women doing this to other women, Israeli female soldiers doing that to other.
Yeah, so we met with like an academic who was doing a study of that, like a Palestinian academic, like how specifically like the female IDFs, these are young, right? These are like 18 to 20-year-olds that will specifically target and sexually humiliate the young Palestinian woman. That's a phenomenon that a lot of people talk about. So yeah, and I mean some other people that stopped us were like Ethiopian, like there were Black people that like was engaging in this. It's true, like the IDF does have like Black members that are there participating in this. Of course, Israel is also an extremely racist state, not only towards Arabs, but towards like everybody. It's a state based on ethno supremacy. It's fundamentally racist. And like it's a militarized society. It's a deeply fascist and right-wing society, deeply nationalist. Like it's everything percolating. And I will say that this isn't my own words. We actually had an event last night in Halifax of Israeli youth who refused to serve in the IDF. You might remember Tal, the guy that refused after October 7th, the first person to refuse to serve in the IDF. So it was two young Israeli that had refused to serve, and they're doing a tour of Canada right now, refuseniks, speaking about why they refused to serve in the IDF. And they talked about how fascist the society is. So she was talking about how when she was in high school and joined the climate movement, and that was the first time she met Palestinians, and then began connecting, obviously, like multiple forms of oppression, particularly also as a queer woman. And then as she's thinking about refusing, as she's planning on refusing, the feminists in her high school are like, feminism is like women serving in the combat units and having like equal opportunity, and she's like, so this is like
nationalism, feminationalism.
Yeah, and they said that the young people, unlike, it's right now, it's cool in Israel among young people to be like as fascist and racist as possible. And that is, when they said when they sat in prison, like people extremely racist. Like, so that's not my words to say that Israel is an extremely racist society. This is the words of Israelis that will talk about this. So yeah, we went to, as we were leaving Hebron, we saw these, and everybody from Hebron, like the settlers are American, right? They're from like Brooklyn, they're from Florida. And then they're like riding a donkey. And it's like, that's not your practice. So part of this is this practice of indigenization, like self-indigenization. So the people who ride donkeys are Bedouin, right? Like, so now they take on, and one of the things they've done is take on shepherding. So they give the young men flocks of sheep, because then you can possess a whole hillside. So one of the ways they're dispossessing the Bedouin is by giving the teenage settlers sheep, and then they say, I'm grazing this whole hill. So it allows you to possess. So the Bedouin, who have been, centuries, the millennia, couldn't let their sheep out.
Taking their
sheep.
Well,
they give the Israeli sheep,
giving that,
and then so they pretend like they're sitting on donkey, acting like they're this is their indigenous practice when they're from Florida. You know what I mean? And then like they are like shepherds now, so from Florida, shepherds, and then they use that to so they're like they possess the hillside, and they'll drive their sheep through like Bedouin communities into people's kitchens, beat the women. So there's like frequent violence. They set dogs on the women and children. In the community we were in, the Bedouin community, his father had been run over by a settler and killed. Like they ran him over with a car. The children actually can't go to school unless escorted either by international observers or like Israeli Jews that come in solidarity, because they set dogs on them. So this is just the level of violence, because many of the communities we visited are places where people are hanging on. So everything's been settled around them, and you'll literally be in someone's community surrounded, like in the hills, and they're staying there, right? So we saw this repeatedly. Those are the communities that were chosen for us to go to see what it means to live in the midst of that violence. So, yeah, it was.
I have a question. This is a question I have prepared, but I really then do have to ask this follow-up question then, which is, I was one. I think both. I think both me and Eve Angler. I can definitely speak for Eve. We both said that we kind of saw a little bit of optimism when we saw the mass protests against the far right government of Likud and all of their far right partners having their radical judicial reforms, which would make the Supreme Court of Israel much more weaker. It would and turn back many gender equality, queer civil rights bills and stuff like that. And of course, there was all these mass protests in Israel against the far right government and the far right agenda of Benjamin Netanyahu and so forth. But everybody would always, skeptics, rightly so, would always say, okay, those protests they may be protesting for a noble cause, but the moment you start to talk to those Israeli protesters about Palestinian liberation, again,
Yeah, that's what we heard last night.
That's where the liberalism, that's where the socialism, and that's where the progressivism ends. Are you actually, yeah, so are you of that?
Yeah, we heard that last night from the youth, that they they were involved in these protests, but there was no understanding that what is happening is tied to the oppression of Palestinians. And I mean, we had an interesting discussion with some like Israeli historians, and one of them, Lee Mordecai, he has called what is happening in Gaza a genocide. But yeah, I think he was, like on a bit of a journey himself, where I think a lot of people sort of like, oh, it's now we've gone off the rails, but not inherent to the project of Zionism, right? Like there was, like you hear that a lot from sort of older leftist Israelis, like, I was on the kibbutz and we did reach out to people. Now it's radicalized, but like not quite coming to the point of view of like this whole ideology. So Zionism, the people that created Zionism as an ideology, was not a single rabbi that was around that table when they're writing this out. They were not just secular, they were atheists. Like, when the early governments of Israel at Golda Meir, these are leftists, allegedly socialists. So you've never had a leftist. I mean, it's only recently as such that the Israeli government has gone hard right. Like it has been through 67. Like these were so-called socialist leftist governments, but their leftism has never.
Yeah. The Labor Party of Israel was even part of the Socialist International, which is a group of all of the mainstream center-left parties, which have all gone to the right.
But this is always part of the myth, right? That the kibbutz was this like ideal socialist space, like, but without any analysis of how it, of course, was participating and is participating in settler colonialism, right? So, as was said to us by some of the Israelis we talked to, like there's very few like Israeli, there's like so no, there's no one in there's no opposition party in the Knesset that's like, no, we shouldn't be doing this. The so-called leftist opposition is not opposed to the genocide of Gaza, the occupation, the apartheid. Like there is no leftist voice. So they are against Netanyahu and the judiciary and this, but not against what is happening to Palestinians. So that has been, and not just recently, that has been the so-called blind spot forever, right?
Well, and in fact, Yair Lapid, who's supposed to be like this liberal centrist, he got into a coalition government with the far rights, with Naftali Bennett, and he explicitly said, and even though he campaigns on two-state solution, he explicitly says, "Oh, we're not going to get rid of illegal settlements in the West Bank or East Jerusalem," and that still is I think that still is like the official thing of the Labor Party of Israel, which has completely.
We talked to Sami and Yafa. We talked to Sami from the Balad Party, and their literal, like, which would seem like the most liberal as such thing is everybody in Israel should have equal rights. They have been repeatedly, they tried to kick them off the election list, charge them with terrorism for saying everybody should have equal rights in Israel. And one of the things he talked about is, as Arab Israeli citizens, of course, this is one of the things that Israel, how can we be apartheid state when we allow, Arabs to have citizenship? But he pointed out, for example, that they will always compare you. They'll say like, you could be in Syria, you know, like rotting in a black site prison. He's like, but I'm not Syrian. Why do you compare me to a Syrian? I am supposedly Israeli. Why do you not compare me to you? But there's no, literally that's like unthinkable that you should be on the same level as me, right? Like that is literally foundational. And he actually gave us a really interesting lecture because his thesis was about Yafa's kind of the case study. This is where, because of course Yafa was the port where settlers began coming through the 1880s when there was the push for settlement. So they were the sort of first area. And Yafa had, of course, been, it was the most metropolitan city in the Middle East. It was extremely rich. It was a business city. And you know, after, of course, 48, like 3,000, 4,000, 3 to 4,000 Palestinians are left in Yafa out of like, you know, hundreds of thousands. And then they're put into quite literally what they refer to in public publications, like in the papers as ghettos. So these are people coming out of the Holocaust that then are like, we put them into the ghetto. And then literally passed a law which said that they were going to like survey houses, and if you weren't in your property, you were neglecting your property and you forfeited your property. Well, of course, either you've been pushed, one of the 3,000 people pushed into this ghetto, or you fled to Gaza, a lot of people, or into Jordan. So they literally, that's how they seized the houses, through this property law. And even if people were in the house, the soldiers would come send you next door, count the house, and then take your house, take your property. So literally people moved into people's like furnished houses and stole that. And that's, Tel Aviv is built on top of Yafa, right? So then when we went on the Nakba tour of Yafa, they show you like, and these are terrorist groups, like Albert Einstein who wrote being like, don't admit these people, like these are terrorists. Like this is who the monuments are for. You know, people that storm like actual terrorists. And but then you see like at various points, like, you know, there would be a sewage that says like municipality of Palestine, you know, property of Palestine, or, you know, there was a railroad track. So this myth that, you know, of course, we made the desert bloom, there was nothing here, which is the ultimate colonial myth of the empty land, terra nullius. We have this in Canada, right? That
Australia as well,
yeah, right? Yeah. Like there was nothing here, they weren't using it, they weren't developed, they should be glad we developed it. And of course, that is a fundamental myth. Shireen Razik writes about it in Race, Space, and the Law, right? Where she says the settler myth begins with the empty land. The indigenous people must be wiped out or imagined to not be present. They're not using the land. The settler tames the land, therefore they own it, because they have been the one that brought the land under control, and then all others should be grateful and latecomers and second-class citizens, right? And so this is the mechanism of settler colonialism, and this is exactly, so for example, the myth, you know, they made the desert bloom, right, which we were all taught. Of course, that's not what happened. Palestinians know how to use, and you see this in Jordan too, right? Like, have lived, you know, for millennia, like on the earth as it is. So Palestinians grow blooming trees, like fruit trees, like avocado, pistachio, olive, you know, which require very little soil. They plant them, you know, they know how to use the natural irrigation, very little water. They use all, you know, so in tune with the natural environment. When the settlers came from Europe, they wanted it to look like Europe. So they came in and planted like European firs that have acidified the soil, destroyed natural species. So one of the things that we heard at the Palestinian Institute for Biodiversity, where they're like keeping the seed and reclaiming like a lot of the Palestinian species, is that settler colonialism is not just destructive to human life, it's destructive to biodiversity, right? So 20, you know, there was a Palestinian fir that has mostly been wiped out that housed 20 species that have therefore, you know, been largely extinct. So this is also part of the settler myth.
These motherfuckers claim
like, in fact, Israel has cut down more olive trees.
Claim that they're like indigenous.
They've cut down millions of olive trees, but when we're taught that they made the desert bloom, but they actually have destroyed and continue to destroy the so when we went to Tent of Nations, every harvest, the settlers come in and burn down and uproot and destroy their trees. This happens over and over again. And yeah, so part of the settlement of Israel was destroying olive trees, which of course are economically important to Palestinians, but also spiritually important, culturally important. And so part of it has been, yeah, uprooting and destroying these trees, but also, of course, like over irrigation, all the problems of the environment, along with war and like weaponry, of course, poisoning the environment. But, you know, so these are the sort of things that you really see. And so, of course, Palestinians, like I said, one way you can tell you're in a Palestinian neighborhood is if there's water tanks on the roof, because they cut Palestinians' water off, so they have to constantly collect water. You know, so you go into these communities, there's like compost toilets and stuff. So people are working with the environment, but you know, the Jewish communities have water 24/7. The Palestinian communities have a few hours of water a week. This is normal. And this is what, you know, if I suppose if anybody watches me talking about this, this will be deemed that I'm being hateful and anti-Semitic and, you know, et cetera, which is like, this can happen, but you just can't notice it. And if you speak about it, which is in plain sight, which is codified in the law, which is, you know, there's one system of law for Palestinians. Palestinians go in front of like military courts, you know, at every point of view, there's literal laws saying this one group of people does not have the same rights as this other group of people. And then when you say, okay, so this is a law and these people don't have these rights, then it's like, how dare you? So this is the condition of like thinking about speaking with, talking to Palestinians, right?
Wow, that's fascinating and deeply disturbing. Then I'm curious, when speaking to Palestinian voices and those in the Palestine Solidarity movement who are there on the front line confronting the apartheid settler colonial state of Israel. Now, I believe most Palestinians advocate BDS in historic Palestine, and amongst the diasporas, you know, they both want a democratic, secular, one-state solution. I'm certainly an advocate of it. The two-state solution, even if one believes in such a foolish idea, is dead and dead, and Israel keeps sabotaging it. And even if one continues to prop it up, it doesn't take into consideration all the Palestinians displaced by the Nakba and their fundamental rights returned. But given the unspeakable crimes against humanity Israel launched on Gaza for the last roughly 2 years, the ongoing suppression and dispossession of Palestinians in the West Bank, which he visited, and East Jerusalem, are there many voices and vocal voices who even reject even the idea now of a democratic, secular, one-state solution and just think that all Israelis should F off and sud off back from where they originally came from,
Well,
including those born and bred in Israel or occupied
I
Palestine?
mean, I can't speak for Palestinians. As Omar said, no one can. There's 10 million Palestinians, and you know, everybody has a different voice. I would say that the majority of what we heard is people recognize that, you know, first of all, as everyone said, we have always lived together. There's Europeans that didn't live together. They're like Jewish people, Muslims, Christians, Armenians, Greeks. We all live side by side. That's what they kept saying. You know, we have been here for thousands of years living together. When you walk through Jerusalem, it's like the Greek quarter, the Armenian quarter. Like, this is people like, we are the ones that were and we lived together with no problems, and until this insertion. So I'm not like, obviously there was, but like, as a society, it has always been this multicultural society, like the so-called, you know, crossroads and cradle of humanity. And so most people would say, like, we can all live together, we have lived together, but we have to live together as equal people. Like, you cannot maintain an ethno state that says, you know, one group of people is superior, but based on their religion and heritage, and this other group, like, that doesn't work. So I can't speak for every Palestinian, obviously, and like, I'm not claiming to, but and I mean, this is exactly something like Balad Party, where people are saying, like, you know, contrary to this idea of, oh, everyone's chasing, you know, everyone wants to eliminate Jews. They're literally like, we should all have equal rights, and that is considered to be a terroristic and a violent statement. Like, we should all have equal rights, which is something, of course, the West claims they stand for: equal human rights and democracy. So this is what people were simply saying. Like, if you're in a democracy with human rights, then everybody has the same right to vote, the same rights to live, you know, the same access to water, the same school. Like, and there can be Jewish schools and Muslim schools, whatever, like there is anywhere else. Like, you can have your culture, you can have your religion, you always have, but legally and politically, there cannot be classes of citizens. And in order for that to happen, though, of course, you have to de-radicalize a society that is stewing in messianism, like militarism, fascism, authoritarianism. So it's not going to happen without, obviously, a de-radicalization of the society, which was, I will say, encouraging about, say, the event last night, though it's very small. And as everybody will tell you, it's not like there's this huge movement of, like, you know, Israeli Jews who are like, yes, you know, like, justice for Palestine. It's tiny, but you are having this movement of people that are saying, no, I'm not going to serve in the IDF. Like, no, I recognize the injustice. Yes, I'm going. Yeah, and one of the things they say is we live in two different realities. If you're an Israeli Jew, you can live your whole life and not encounter the notion of occupation. Like, it doesn't affect you economically. You are the upper class. Palestinians live with it every day. So, you know, they see it and feel it, but so quite literally part of what people said repeatedly, like when we talk to Israelis, is that like we don't feel the war. It doesn't have an impact. It's not having an economic impact. We're not losing that many people, like maybe a soldier a day, like not enough to, you know, life goes on. Like you're in Tel Aviv, your life is no different. You're in Gaza, you're experiencing genocide. They also don't see images. So their TV and news is heavily censored. So we see much more of what's happening than somebody 5 kilometers from Gaza and Israel, right? Like so in some way they willfully have no idea. Somebody actually told me, like someone from Israel actually told me that when they showed the videos of Sinwar, the reason why they thought that was a miscalculation is because it was the first time people saw destroyed Gaza. Because when they broadcast the images of them killing Sinwar, people are like, wait a minute, like Gaza's blown up. Because they aren't showing that. So they're also completely unaware. So you grow up in Israel, they said it's a form of brainwashing. It is brainwashing. You are, you're taught like we are threatened by everybody. Everybody's out to get us for no reason. We are defending ourselves. The world hates us. We are the victims. If we breathe, they're waiting to kill us, so we must defend ourselves. We are inside of truth. We are justice. And you don't meet Palestinians, you don't, like, this is what they talk about.
You're describing like all of my friends who come from Israel, we're not really friends anymore, but you're basically describing all of the Israeli Zionist communities I've grown up with in the West, from the U.S. to Belgium.
And again, I'm repeating what Israelis told me, like Jewish Israelis have told me. Like this is not my freestyle. This is what repeatedly people have said and like that recognize this. So, so of course, like they are Jewish. They recognize that, associating their religion, their heritage, their culture with this, a very recent ideological development, like they're very critical of that. But yeah, you see it in Israel. And so it's really like that duality is what I'm not an expert, right? I was only there for a couple of weeks. I'm not claiming, but Palestinians are experts. And, when you're talking to them and just small things like, Larine, who is a citizen, but her papers had expired, so she can't leave Israel to go to school for grad school, because if she leaves and doesn't have the visa, she can't come back. Can't plan your future. As I said, can't plan to see your friend this evening because you don't know if you're going to be held at a checkpoint. They put down the gate, now you're not leaving your community for 5 days, 6 days until they decide to let you out. Like that is just a fact of life. And they would say, oh, it's because of like security. Like we have to secure this, but yeah, but I mean, genuinely, as many people have said, like that is what they're taught in school. That is what is on the media. So it's very, very difficult. I'm actually friends with someone who ended up conscientious objecting years ago. Like he's in exile. And he talked about, there really wasn't a structure. And first he did serve in the IDF and then came to understand. And it was like a process to object. And of course, he can't go back to Israel. So like,
and
I'll say that like it's the whole like it's not just it's like you get the job based on where you were in the military, and if you serve in the military, you're told, oh, if you're good at computers, go into them, then you can get this great job with a security firm and make money. Like it's so tied to it's just part of life, right? That you participate in the occupation, then you live a good life, and like that. So how are Palestinians expected to live side by side with that without that changing? That status quo has to change, and for the safety and well-being of like it's not like it doesn't affect the Israelis. It's just that they don't like. Of course, it's impacting them, right?
Interesting. So I guess there's optimism there that even despite all the unspeakable crimes that Israel unleashed on the people of Gaza and what they continue to do day in and day out with complete immunity, thanks to our ghastly Western, states and even the complicit Gulf states and whatnot, that there are still Palestinians in their millions that are still saying democratic, secular, one-state solution. But then I have to ask you, you want to respond to that?
Oh no, yeah. I mean, I don't want to speak for the political inclinations. I'm just saying that everyone, and I mean, obviously, it's like Sabil's religious, so obviously, we talk to like liberation people, but I mean, the people we talked about nonviolent resistance, which is everything, as they said, short of causing harm to humans. Everything else is on the table, and so there was a lot of campaigns around like checkpoint resistance and like creative resistance, which includes things like taking over houses and refusing to leave, having patrols so people can stay in their houses, like all kinds, when we were in Ida refugee camp, you know, the cultural center there is amazing. In the house of his parents from 48. And there's a guest house there that you can stay in Ida refugee camp. Every room is named for a Palestinian writer or artist. Beautiful guest house, named after his mother, I believe. But the IDF had turned the office in the community center into an interrogation center. Which is the kind of psychological game played, that this is a place where beauty and art, and they teach the kids theater and music and robotics and dance. And so the IDF deliberately comes and interrogates and tortures people in the office to try and make it unsafe for people. So, you know, this is just the kind of story that you heard over and over and over again. Like sorry, I'm trying to turn my email off so you don't hear all this buzzing. Now I turned off the Zoom somehow, so I don't know how to get back. Where's my Zoom? I guess we're not going to cut that. Okay, sorry, go ahead.
Well, then I have to ask you this question. Which is, how is Black Canada doing when it comes to mobilizing more against Canadian imperialism and pan-European, pan-North American imperialism? Because I've noticed more and more social media posts from Black Lives Matter Canada demanding people mobilize against Canadian complicity in Rwanda's endless aggression against my mother's country of the Congo, and the civil wars in both North and South Sudan, which Canada and the West is completely complicit in in that ghastly divide and conquer, and mobilizing against yours truly, Israel. So tell me, are we finally seeing in Black Canada a growing anti-imperialist movement? And I've also been seeing your friend and your comrade Robin Maynard also posting or reposting a lot of these, you know, calls to actions.
Well, I think what you realize is in personal conversation, and not just Black people, like obviously, I mean, I'm sure people who are like highly, you know, pro-Israel probably won't be in conversation with me, but like your normal people, if you talk to them, everybody like knows what is happening in Gaza is wrong. It's just people are scared to say things. Like, yeah. You know, your random like middle class church people, when you're like, oh, I went to Palestine, you know, they're like, wow, you know, what happening in Gaza? Like, I don't actually like and we're seeing this in polls. Like the majority of people do not support what Israel is doing. Yet, of course, politically on this level, we have this like unanimous support. It's a project of the elites, right? That the average person is humane enough to say, like, even if they agree, you know, don't have the politics down and don't, you know, they'll say what is happening to those children in Gaza is terrible. That shouldn't be happening. That is common sense. But people are scared to say it. Because we have created obviously a culture of repression where we are told that it's hateful, it's bigoted, you will lose your job, you will, you know, these things will happen to you. And of course, many people, you're actually kind of lucky if you're an activist where, you know, you do have support networks. I can speak to Jewish people who are, you know, like doing this work as well. Like, you know, I can speak to Palestinians, I can speak to Israelis, like I'm in an activist community. Your average person doesn't really have that to anchor them. So they're like, what's happening is terrible, but I don't want to like lose my job and I don't want to be called a bigot and I don't know, so I'm just going to keep it to myself, right? And that is true of Black people as well. I think as Ta-Nehisi Coates, you know, like hardly a radical writer, but obviously observed many of the things I've observed about just the daily experience of apartheid in Palestine, for which he, of course, like immediately got knocked off his like pet. He worked for the Atlantic, which the editor was a former IDF, so you know, like, and so he's like one of them, right? He was a darling of the liberal set until he started talking about Palestine, and then. But one of the things that people said to us in Palestine, we heard from Al Jazeera journalists, from activists, from like preachers, etc. They said the thing that burns the most is the betrayal, because they said it's not that people believe that Israel is right. If that was true, then you could at least try to convince them, right? You could say, okay, you don't understand, so let me tell you. But they said over and over again, our colleagues, our journalists in other countries have said to us they understand. They've prayed with us. They come on delegations. They've said, and then they go home and then they say Israel has a right to defend itself. I'm resigned. Like, it's the betrayal. People have taken, you know, Raphael Warnock prayed with people in Palestine, came on a delegation. He took money from AIPAC and walked back everything he said about Palestine in the pursuit of his own personal power. That happens again and again and again. And they said it's that betrayal. Like, you're a journalist in Palestine and your colleagues, you go to put a story into the newswire and then it gets cut at the BBC or the World Service or whatever by someone who knows damn well your story is true, but is too much of a coward to put it on the air. And so that has been the issue. And that is also, of course, Black people who are vulnerable in our jobs. And like, that's the case for Black people as well, right? So yes, there's always been a radical Black tradition of solidarity with Palestine, recognizing that the same oppressive forces across the globe, and not just as we said in Haiti, in like, this is not unique to Israel. Israel is not unique. Like, it's not the first and only and ever society to, go a hard right militaristic turn. Like, this happens over and over and over again. It will happen in other places. Israel is not unique. It should not be singled out. We're not singling out Israel. We're making the same critique as Israel as we would make of any state, including the US, including Canada. I would make the exact same critiques. Canada's a settler colonial nation founded on genocide that is racist too. I have no problem saying that, like I say that all the time. So I think that, yeah, like, it's all been part of the Black tradition, but I think people have been scared. I think in general, there's been, as time has gone on, I think what we're seeing is so extreme. B, of course, as more people speak out, people do get some courage. It's become, I do think, less taboo to speak out. But I think there's a way to go with Black people. My experience is Black people know it's wrong, but aren't particularly they'll say, like, I'm not trying to lose my Black job over somebody else. Like, I have enough problems as a Black person. It's kind of what I hear a lot. Why should a Black person, like, you're an idiot if you're a Black person and you, like, sacrifice your life over someone who's not Black? It's kind of like,
yeah,
what
I have a problem. I have a problem with that, which is which is definitely another that's a topic for another day.
But I will say, and I mean, I actually told people in Palestine that this was some of the discourse that was going on, and they were quite surprised because Palestine has always given credit and spoken about the influence of Black liberation upon their struggle. In Silwan, where they have eyes painted, they paint the eyes of, like, the Malcolm X's eyes are painted on the building, like Desmond Tutu, Nelson Mandela. There's on the wall in Bethlehem is, Eric Garner, George Floyd. Like, they've repeatedly shown solidarity with Black liberation movements. Munt Isak's book, the preface is by a Black liberation theologist. Like, there was a Pan-African flag up in Hebron. Like, they, when we went into the Bedouin community, they had Pan-African flags. Like, they very much recognize their debt to the Black struggle, their influence in the Black struggle, and their kinship. Now, that doesn't mean that anti-Black racism doesn't exist, because it exists everywhere, including among Black people, like, including our own colorism and shadism and, like, our own diasporic politics. And, like, we have that. Never mind.
Exactly.
No one is denying that there is, because anti-Blackness is global. But to suggest that we should not have solidarity with Palestinians because of some mythically, like, pathological anti-Blackness that is somehow worse than any other anti-Blackness and is disqualifying, that is A, like, solidarity is not transactional. B, like, given the impacts on policing, prison, like, that we cannot see how these things affect us in our own condition, whether or not we care for Palestinians. But yeah, I mean, that's been a very sort of difficult narrative to hear and see, and obviously one that's been pushed for, like,
I've expressed to you a couple of times. I remember expressing to when we had our special anti 4th of July, anti Canada Day with Margaret Kimberly. I hear from Black nationalists and Black left and some of the best Black leftists who have interviewed Indigenous people. They know the plight of Native Americans and so forth, and then they'll say something like, "Oh, some Native Americans had tribes, ergo, I'm not going to show them solidarity until they show us more solidarity," and so they completely eradicate the 1% of anti-Black racism that Native Americans actually do practice, when mostly Native Americans are just fighting to live in the multicultural, settler colonial project that is America. So that's very great. All that what you just said. I think it's very optimistic to see more Black Lives Matter and just Black racial justice groups in Canada protesting more against, Canadian imperialism in Congo, Sudan.
I don't know. You saw, of course, friend of the show, Eve Angler. You saw what happened to him recently,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
And so we know, I mean, so Eve Angler was charged and arrested allegedly for harassing, for like contact with, like critique, like self-proclaimed Zionists. Like I'm not using that term; she uses that term. And like he did not tag her; he just made public commentary on public statements she had made, like critiquing her what he termed as genocidal racist statements. She had tried to get him charged back in the summer. The police looked into it, closed it, and then a politician actually pushed them and wrote letters. And so a journalist in Canada was charged with harassment, not only of this person, but then of the police for talking about it. So now he's like harassing the police and was held in jail for 5 days. So if we as Black people cannot see how this kind of repression affects us, like this is part of the backlash of 2020, and we took the streets. So this is a way, and I've been saying this, that it's not a simplistic, there's this kind of like, oh, Zionists control the media. It's not like, that's a very simplistic reading. The police are opportunists, and the police want money in the budgets, and they've always seen like this idea of hate crimes as a way to get, like to shift to get more money. When I was doing the defunding report, the things they started countering me with was hate crimes and sexual assault, right? Like, what about hate crimes? And, there'll be rapists running the street. So and many Black people fell into this trap of advocating for like prosecution of hate crimes and hate crimes units. So there's like a ton of money given by our DOJ and stuff for like inquiries into hate crimes and cyber hate online, which is all forms of repression, right? And Aziza and others spoke up against the mistake that was being made by like liberal Black groups in advocating for like these harsh repression of speech under the guise of like fighting hate speech. That's not new. It's not something that just emerged post October 7th. It's piggybacked onto, because like they see this, so now rising anti-Semitism is a reason to like police protest, but they were using hateful gatherings and stuff before that. Was obviously not pro-convoy, but me and Desmond did speak out consistently and principled about the way that the police were used in that. So I can disagree with the politics of the convoy and disagree with passing an Emergencies Act, which we all knew was going to set a terrible precedent in terms of taking people's money, garnishing, going into the banks, and we both, Desmond Cole and I both said the effective resistance to the convoy was when communities pushed them out. Like when people took the bridge with bikes and were like, that, we have the power to do that. The police were like part of that anyway. So why would we call upon the police who are, so this is the problem on the so-called left as well, is people cannot maintain principled positions. And so we buy into stuff like hate crimes or, let's seize the accounts of the convoy or, and then of course, these are the seeds for the repression later on. So like the police have always wanted more funding. This moment, they've seen a way to repress our protests, to get more funding under the guise of combating anti-Semitism, just like they'll claim it's combating anti-Blackness and racism and rape culture, whatever they want to say, to get more money. And so we as Black people should recognize that, like the danger in what is happening around the repression of speech, ostensibly to end anti-Semitism, but really, of course, like for the goal
of silence anti-Zionist voices, which
but it's also, of course, anti-corporate voices, anarchist voices, like people that want to divest from oil and gas. Like it's like not just like exclusive to this one area of politics. Like, so I think it's just important to recognize that like these are trends that we've seen that are being exploited in this moment, but have always existed,
And actually, changing subjects entirely, because we have to talk about prisons and the abolishment. But before I talk specifically about both of those, I wanted to return to the subject of serial killers and rehabilitation. And but before I ask, let me ask you this, which is, have you ever read?
You always go so long, and I'm going to cut you off soon. Yeah, go ahead.
But have you ever read the book or seen the film based on the book, A Clockwork Orange? And
no, Clockwork Orange. I haven't seen it, but like I'm familiar with it. Yeah.
But did you ever read the book or
No.
Okay, then all right, then I'm gonna skip that question. But
What were you
actually,
gonna ask me about Clockwork Orange?
yeah. No. I wanted to ask you a question about a Clockwork Orange, but I guess I could ask you a pretty vague one, and then get to these like very last one, which is now the book. Of course, you have this degenerate monster, Alex DeLarge, serial rapist and whatnot, and and is a hoodlum, and he's like the textbook anti-social moral degenerate delinquent who engages in acts of violence. Has absolutely you know no remorse whatsoever, finally gets put in a jail, and they have a cure for him. They have a cure that they can get rid of all of those like evil impulses. The pastor, though, who he works with in the jail, says that he argues against this cure for evil because he says that folks should be able to have a choice. You should be able to either be a good person and to be a bad person. If you are going to be a bad person, at least face the consequences of that. But I was just thinking to myself, isn't that a pretty rotten deal for those who become victims of the Alex DeLarges of the world, the real life ones? And isn't prison the only game in town until a better alternative comes along for that? I'm curious your response to that.
Well, I mean, first of all, those are extreme examples, right? So when we turn to the serial killer example, first of all, let's not forget that in so many cases, the police are the ones fumbling the investigations into serial killers, as happened in Canada with Bruce McArthur, who was murdering gay immigrant men for like many years. And they were being reported missing. The gay community was saying, we think there's a serial killer operating, and they were ignored. Of course, Robert Pickton in Canada killed many sex workers on the east side of Vancouver, many Indigenous women. Very early on, a woman actually escaped with like the key to the handcuff that fit into the other side of the handcuff, and they didn't believe her and said she was a drug addict and a prostitute and didn't investigate, and they literally had the evidence on them. So when we talk about serial killers and say, well, prison is the solution, first of all, let's talk about how the police frequently are aware of serial killers operating and like are totally incompetent. So the thing that we say we need the police for, like, you need the police because there'll be serial killers running around. Well, when are they actually catching these serial killers? Like, we had a mass casualty commission report in my province because, of course, the mass shooter that was known to the police and had done in like so many disgusting things to sex workers that were known, like was a violent to his partner, violent to many women. Police knew this, didn't do anything, shot up multiple people, could have been intervened in. So let's talk about that first before we start talking about serial killers. Second, of course, serial killers is such a minor part of what people are in prison for. So I don't think anybody's like advocating that serial killers should just roam this society. I think everybody is clear that people who are unsafe to themselves and others need to be where they can't harm people. That doesn't need to look like mass imprisonment, though. Like obviously nobody's advocating that Paul Bernardo like roam our communities, but that doesn't need to be in the current prison system as it exists and as it
Well,
is.
you know what? You've just laid into it. So forget A Clockwork Orange, but let's definitely return to that one in the future.
In the future. But yeah, I just think that like first of all,
because the work you do, you've worked with prisoners. I believe you still work with prisoners, and have some of those prisoners been people who have been convicted of sexual assault, murder, and stuff like that. So I'm curious, have they expressed deep remorse over their actions, and what was the teaching and methods that your work has done with them to get them to see that their actions were wrong, them wanting to turn over a new leaf, be better persons, and prove that they can be redeemed?
Most murder is young men, and it's circumstantial, like people that are involved in drug trade, and guns go out because people are scared, so they're carrying guns because they've been threatened, and then the gun gets pulled, it goes up. Like, it's not like, and of course the harm is I'm not minimizing. I never want to sound like I'm minimizing what it is to have a loved one murdered or what it is to be a victim of violent crime. Like, those things impact us generationally. They are deeply traumatic. People never recover from them. They in fact impact entire families, they impact communities. They're serious things. Like, violence is serious, and I have no interest in minimizing it. But what I'm saying is TV often teaches us this idea of these like the serial killer who's outsmarting the police, who just like takes joy, and that's not, it's usually like young men who get involved in the streets, and to put it this way, shit pops off. And of course, people are deeply remorseful. Of course, it's terrible to have taken life and to live with that. You know, like people, of course, they want to make reparation. Of course, they know they've harmed their families and communities. Like, but they're not. And we don't, it's not minimizing the harm caused to also say that people are not monsters, right? That doesn't say the harm isn't monstrous. It's to say the person is not the monster. Of course, for most people now, in a tiny amount of people, yes, like there are some psychopaths, some sociopaths, but that is like so rare. The majority of people is like, you know, they were driving the getaway and they shot and the person died. They, you know, there was a dispute and like they felt they were protecting themselves. Like there's usually a reason, like, which doesn't mean it's right. It doesn't mean I'm excusing it. I'm just saying that like the idea that people are just these like complete psychopaths that just go around killing people for no reason is just not the case. People are also victims of deep trauma themselves that had it been intervened into. Usually sexual abuse, which we do not take seriously despite our rhetoric around that. So people who are sexually abused as children grow up to be incarcerated in large amounts, right? Like there's like literally a study called the sex abuse to prison pipeline for men and women, not only women.
Wow. I didn't
You
know
know,
that.
violence in the home, generational violence, generational trauma. Like if we were putting the resources into intervening in those things, prison is, and like that's the thing's already done. By the time somebody's dead, the prison is like that's no intervention. It doesn't bring the person back. The intervention you want is before that happens, which means you have to intervene into mental health, into trauma, into family violence, into generational trauma, and put the resources into that, which should actually bring down the things, you know, like, so yeah, I don't believe that we need to dehumanize people in order to talk about harm. I have worked with violent people who have done reprehensible things, sometimes to people I know. That's not exclusive to like, you know, and some stuff, yes, that's being hard. Like some stuff I'm not, you know, like you always, when you do prison work, you always hit those moments where you're like, can I advocate for this person that killed an Indigenous woman? Like, and sometimes you're not comfortable. Obviously, child sex abuse, like, of course, who's gonna be comfortable with that? If you become comfortable with that, you need to like go check yourself in because like you should never be comfortable with that. So you're always going to have that question. But we're advocating about rights, not about character. So like you can recognize that what somebody did is harmful, disgusting, reprehensible, those things, and also say that it takes from us if we torture them, if we put them in solitary confinement, if we treat them in this particular way, right? So,
Well,
yeah.
it's interesting. I managed to despite constantly like fainting because like I when I see like like extreme violence now, like my brain just kind of like turns off and so forth. But I managed to get through watching a 3-part docu series on Jeffrey Dahmer,
Oh
which last
God.
time. Yeah. Which the last time you were on with our dear comrade,
Yeah.
she was explaining us the Jeffrey Dahmer case, and I did manage to get through in an entire day, but with many breaks in between the mini series of Dahmer dramatized with.
I would never watch that. I get enough of that stuff in my everyday life. I mean, I
Yeah,
can
I know.
you feel like did you watch this thing involving crime? The answer is no, because I hear like so much of this stuff in real life. I really have zero interest in engaging with it in like fiction
Exactly.
or otherwise, you know.
What I thought was interesting when watching the docu series and even the like dramatic mini series about Jeffrey Dahmer was the following: that Jeffrey Dahmer expressed a lot deep remorse for his actions. He even asked, the lawyer who, before they even go to courts, it's all taped and so forth. He even asked his lawyer if he was sick or just evil. So he had very much self-awareness for his actions, and I think knew that his actions were wrong, yet continued to act on,
I know the case where the police could have intervened and stuff. So yeah.
Exactly. And do you think would studying his brain have provided any answers? I'm curious your thoughts because
No, this is like that. I actually teach this to my class, like the fascination of serial killers. So I mean, this is such a minor. I mean, like corporations are serial killers, like police departments are serial killers, like our politicians are serial killers. But like in terms of serial killing, as like it's because it has this fictional fascination, I think like we believe that there's this overwhelming, this is very rare. This is not, so most murder is not serial killing. Even mass murder, mass killing is not serial killing. Like this sort of like pathological psycho, whatever, like this is so rare. So in a way, it's like,
so the Jeffrey Dahmer
it dominates far more of the discussion on crime than it actually takes up in terms of like, the vast majority of crime is not this, right? Like the vast majority of violence is not this violence. And in fact, it's much more like everyday violence that we live with that is not prosecuted. Like such as, the fact that the 90% plus of rapes never like see a courtroom, right? Like the sexual assault, sexual harassment, these things, sexual violence happens all around us. Gendered and intimate violence happens all around us all the time and is excused. So I think we would be much better placed to focus on education around violence in our households, in our communities, in gendered violence, like intimate violence. That's where we have to start within our families. This is where violence begins. And that's the kind of violence we experience. We are very unlikely to be killed by a serial killer. We are very likely to be raped or beaten or emotionally abused or by members of our family and people we are close to in our friend circles. This is where our violence happens. So how do we can educate on that. We can change that. We can intervene in that. We can teach parents differently. We can teach children differently. We do teach and can teach about consent and should do better. We can teach about boundaries. We can teach about we can treat trauma. Like these are things that are not evil, but when left untreated and when there are no outlets and when then they can in these cases, in the worst cases, turn into something like Jeffrey Dahmer, and other cases turn into so-called routinized violence. But I don't think it's productive as such to use a framework as evil. I'm not going to deny that someone like Jeffrey Dahmer is evil, but that is not the main framework for the vast majority of what we're talking about when we're talking about harm. And I think we need to really confront harm as it happens.
I still think what's fascinating about I still think what's fascinating about the Dahmer case, not the horrific crimes he did. Although I am very fascinated, I still think that the documentary and the miniseries could have focused more on the police incompetency and so forth. But hey, okay, but what I still find fascinating is here you have this real life Jason Voorhees, I guess, type of a serial killer expressing deep remorse, and the fact that he was murdered by another prisoner who claimed he did it to avenge, the victims of it. I think it reminds me of why I hate the death penalty. But I also think it's disgusting that we cheer on the raping of prisoners who might have committed sexual assaults and so forth, or even the murder of other murderers in prison, as opposed to, I don't know. I just think
you should be raped in prison. Are you volunteering? Are you willing to line up to rape the person? So if you think somebody should be raped in prison, are you willing to go in and rape that person? If they're strapped down, can you rape them? If not, then maybe you should what you want to do is outlier for violence to somebody else. So unless you're willing to do it yourself, it's probably not something you stand by. And if you are willing to do it yourself, then you're a rapist and you should be in prison. So now what? And then you should be raped. So obviously this doesn't take us anywhere, right? By your own logic, you think somebody should be raped, but you don't want to do it, but you think it should happen. But if you do it, that would make you a rapist, which would therefore mean that you yourself deserve to be raped. And now we're in an endless, it doesn't take us anywhere. It doesn't make any sense. Now, this doesn't mean that victims, when I've been harmed, I've had extremely, of course it's normal to, if you are a victim, I'm not calling upon victims to have forbearance and forgiveness. Nobody can ask that of you. That is a personal decision. It is between you and yourself, not even the other person. That is something people make for their own healing. Nobody has the right to demand somebody else forgive or whatever. That's not what we're talking about. What we are talking about is a state system and how a state system uses revenge and punitive and violence and torture in order for this kind of vicarious idea of justice. And that is not just. That is not actually what we have a system for. We actually are supposed to have this system because we're not supposed to go and become vigilantes and take things into our own hands, right? Like that's why we like outsource them as such to the court system. But I do have to go soon, so and it's also
Sure,
like
sure,
so
no problem.
hot in here. Like
But
I'm like,
well, but the final question is this, and I'll have to, and of course, I'm going to have you back on to even dig deeper into that.
I'm still like alive,
But,
I guess. Like after talking about going to Palestine.
the final question. My final question is this: have you ever read or studied both the work, the work, both of the works of French philosophers, sociologists, also leftist, Michel Foucault,
Yes,
who did Discipline and Punishment, Madness of Civilization. I've not read Foucault, but what do both of those books and the theories he lays out help us understand about modern prisons and mental institutions, and why do you think a better world is the abolishment of that? And when it comes to mental institutions, I think we need that merged into a single payer healthcare system, and I think mental health care and a system where a mental health care system where compassionate treatment is the key, not strong authoritarian discipline and fire and brimstone, tough on crime approach to those able to control themselves when they do hurt people and themselves and so forth. So
I am a stereotypical academic in my quoting of Foucault, because yes, I do find Foucault very useful. So Foucault, I mean, first of all, biopower, I think is a like, so this is how states mobilize knowledge in order to manage populations, which is like exactly what we see. I mean, I started by talking about like border control, right? So Foucault was very interested in this, like how states manage populations, both ideologically and then at like the literal level of control. So what he's talking about in Discipline and Punishment, this is going to be like a very short summary, but he essentially says that, we look back at the medieval period, we're like, oh, how barbaric, like they hung people in public, they draw and quartered them, like how could they do that? They were monsters. Thank God we're more progressive. But he suggests that the hallmark of this sort of modern progressive state has been like the privatization and the hiding of punishment. So kind of what I said about if you believe somebody should be raped, are you volunteering to do it? This is sort of, in a sense, Foucault, because he would say that like people like stood by what they like it had this, they believed that punishment had a salutary effect, so you went and participated, you watched the hanging, you watched that, you heard the screams, and like you could not separate yourself from that. And the hallmark of sort of our progressive age is we hide it behind the wall and bureaucratize it and say it's nothing to do with me, but I want it done, I want this person raped, so I'm going to set up the conditions in a violent prison where that happens, but I don't have the guts to watch it happen or do it so his point is that this is kind of the hallmark of the modern state, is like these institutions that develop simultaneously. So the prison, the mental asylum, like the professionalized military, the factory, the school, medicalization, the medical industry, scientific. So all these things are coming up at the same time. And that what they have in common is that they are meant to normalize us, to make us good citizens and workers, and everything outside of that is pathologized. So we are either criminals or we are mentally ill, like we are diagnosed, or we become like the refuse of capitalism, like we can't work, so we get like sent to the prison. So the school, the factory, these are all meant to shape us into workers and citizens. The military, like this is what these institutions, this is a very like sort of quick summary. But this is like very helpful in terms of, so then how does the prison function, right? The prison is like an essential part of the administrative state. So he, in explaining this is around, and then like what is outside of that is pathologized, whether like our gender, our racial identity, like, and so he has a lot to say about medicalization as well, right? Like not like anti-doctor, but the idea of like diagnosing everything. So one moves from a kind of religious idea of sin and evil to like, you have this diagnosis, like you are a diagnosed sociopath, right? And so how that again participates, what I call in my book, the violence of the paperwork, is kind of like a version of Foucault, right? Like, so through the bureaucratic state, this violence is done at the border, in the prison, by these files that are kept on us, and the surveillance, and the endless like panopticon of being watched and having your number put down. And like we can see this in Palestine right now. I gave you examples, right? Like, let's have different license plates. That's not violent, but only some people can go on this road, but that's not violent. And then you're filed as Arab Israeli citizen and you have these 200 less rights, but that's not violent. Like, this is exactly what Foucault is talking about. So, I find him very useful. And I don't believe in everything Foucault says, as you don't with like every theorist. Like one can dispute many things and always dispute like the Eurocentrism and stuff. But I think it's a helpful frame. I use it a lot when I'm teaching, like with my students in like early years, to have them think about the connections between these, and I think it's helpful. So yeah, I mean, the idea of theory, I think for those who, if you're like, God, why are we talking about theory? It's not that we accept everything. It's to give us a useful frame for putting our ideas together, and then we can deviate from it in the ways we want. But useful theory, whether that's Marx, whether that's Fanon, is something that clarifies for us. So you say, oh, I kind of sense that those things fit together, but you've really clarified for me how I can make that connection. And that's what theory is for. Like, it's not supposed to be inaccessible and only for those of us who take grad school. It's supposed to be a tool for interpreting and thinking about the world. And then we add our own perspective, we add other things. So I think a lot of people in this day and age we're taught like theory isn't for us, it's like elitist, but it's just a tool for sharpening our thoughts about the world. And we take from it what is helpful to our thoughts and leave what is not. So I do find Foucault helpful. I do use
Interesting.
quite a bit.
But he had and then the final one is, but he doesn't but does he have like a vision of we can do this better, or that this is just, or that the prisons are a necessary evil, the mental institutions a necessary evil, and diagnosis is a necessary
I
evil?
don't know that Foucault is like interested in so much like the organization or activism side. He's more like laying out why, like this is how these things function. Like, so he talks a lot about like the medical exam, the school exam. Like he's talking a lot about like the enforced normality, like this notion of like the violent normal, like norm, and like being forced to conform, right? Like, and how that takes place, and like why the state is managing us in these particular ways. So like, yeah, I disagree with it, but like, it's not like a text for then like here's how you resist. It's laying out so that you understand it. So I think he's more interested in like, telling you about it as such. So I don't know like if Foucault would qualify as, like an abolitionist in this day and age. Like I don't know, but I don't know if there's anybody that's thought about prisons that hasn't sort of used Foucault as one of the helpful kind of historical and analytical tools for thinking about like, and when you're like, yeah, that makes sense. Like that is why the prison does that thing that they do. Like that makes sense. Foucault has explained to me why they would do that. Like that tracks, that's kind of why it's useful. Oh, that's why they make them work in Forcan in a sweatshop, and why the women like fucking sew underwear for the men. Like that makes sense because it's a form of gender conformity that they're trying to, like, so this kind of thing. It makes sense just in terms of analyzing how the prison works, why the state invests in prisons. And then when you understand that, and you can understand how that connects to the border and how that connects to like anti-trans politics and so when we're looking at what's happening right now in this current like cruel massive like genocide, border policy, like tough on crime, cracking down on protesters, like Foucault is one of the tools that will explain to you why that is happening. And like, how do those things connect? They seem disparate. The tech industry, like this is how they all connect, right? So yeah, we should always read and critique, right? Like, don't let people convince you that reading is elitist, and reading is not beyond us. Like working men's clubs, etc. Like there were libraries down the mines, In fact, that is one of the great, someone was commenting on this the other day and I agree. And it's like actually because of media, like when we got TV and stuff, but the working classes were the most educated, like there was constant reading clubs and political clubs, and the loss of political education and the idea that it's elitist and only belongs to university classroom has been one of the reasons why we've struggled to organize. We've like, so this idea that, we convince ourselves and others that, reading this kind of stuff is beyond, it's meant to be read. So read it, critique it. You don't have to, it doesn't make you smart or less smart or whatever. It's just like helpful for thinking about things, which we should always be doing. So I guess I read your theory. Come on.
Oh, brilliant. Very inspiring. Well, we were joined on this on another epic edition of 1+1 with the always brilliant, beautiful, and stupendous L. Jones, Dr. L. Jones, who, let me remind folks, is a social justice warrior, racial justice activist, abolitionist, all-around black feminist, leftist, anti-imperialist, poet, journalist with the Halifax Examiner and The Breach, author of Live at the Afrikan Resistance, which is a collection of her poetry, which is brilliant. Abolitionist Intimacies is her latest publications. contributor to Sick of the System, Why the COVID-19 Recovery Must Be Revolutionary, another book I need to urgently get. And she's also co-host of Black Power Hour at CKDU 88.1 FM, a community campus radio station in Halifax. And she's also a university professor, assistant professor at the Department of Political Canadian Studies at Mount Saint Vincent University in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Miss Jones, Dr. Jones, Bellel, thank you so much for taking the time, especially on a Friday evening after a rally, to come on this small show. Keep doing it for the bulk.
I would stay longer, but I have early morning workout, so, you know.
Well, no problem, man.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you. Thanks, Yuri.